Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Connecting Housing and Education, How a Data Sharing Partnership Can Improve Outcomes for Children in Your Community. I'm Rebecca Cohen, an associate at Apt Associates, and I've been working with a great team to plan this session that includes representatives from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Education, as well as representatives from the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities, or CLAFA, and Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, or SAFE. We're thrilled to be hosting this important webinar today. To minimize interference on the line, all attendees will be muted for the duration of this webinar. All questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Calvin Johnson, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Research, Evaluation, and Monitoring at HUD, and Ross Santee, Associate Commissioner in the Administrative Division at ED's National Center for Education Statistics. And now I'll turn it over to Calvin.
The roadmap provides a guide for housing providers and educators on what to consider as you begin thinking about data sharing. So that probably applies to the third who is actually new to the topic, how to take the first steps, and provides available resources that you might consider along the way. Just want to talk about a recent experience just for about 30 seconds here, where I was on a site visit, and I just so happened to be sitting with an executive director of a housing authority and the school superintendent. And when they were talking about, challenges they were having, and I just so happened to have had recently reviewed the Data Sharing Roadmap. I pointed them to the roadmap, and within a few days, I received a news article where there was a commitment made by the housing authority and the school district to enter into a data sharing agreement to tackle those challenges. Undoubtedly, data sharing between housing providers and education will provide new insight on areas where the two can work together to improve school outcomes for the children they already jointly serve. After this webinar, if you're not already doing so, I encourage housing providers and educators on this call to start the dialogue about how you might share data in support of the educational achievement of those children you already have joint responsibility for serving. Again, really excited about the call, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Calvin. This is Ross Santee with the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, and I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us on the webinar. We have been working for about 3 years, since May of 2015, between ED and HUD on some regular meetings to discuss related projects and find and identify the opportunities to leverage our resources across these projects. So today's webinar is a direct outcome and a direct product of those meetings that we've been having, as both agencies have a shared interest in our state and local decision makers really having access to the best high-quality information that they can get to move initiatives forward. The Department of Education recently finished a strategic plan initiative in which we were outlining our strategic plan for fiscal years 2018 through 22. And inside that plan, there's a strategic goal around expanding post-secondary educational opportunities, improving outcomes to foster economic opportunity, and promote an informed and thoughtful, productive citizenry. Goals that we know conceptually we share with HUD and a number of other federal agencies. So the opportunity to keep finding and building those bridges and connections has been really productive. So we know residents of HUD-assisted housing will benefit from the focus that we've got in our strategic plan and our collaboration with HUD, as they can use their housing platforms to expand access to not only educational services, but hopefully employment services and things, resources from a number of different agencies. This all goes and shows a lot of example of what we know from our technical assistance work with states is how much potential value there is in properly connected and shared data. State education agencies have been building student-level longitudinal data systems that's really initiated within K-12, but in almost all cases have expanded well beyond that realm. State governors and legislatures are pushing for the deeper and more robust knowledge that they can get about their population by connecting K-12 to post-secondary or workforce or early childhood data, and to really understand what's happening as people within their states and within their neighborhoods move through their educational careers and their workforce preparation stages and join, hopefully, productive workforce, productive careers. So housing is a key part of this, we know, and the delivery and the types of services that HUD and HUD-assisted housing provides is critical to this. So connecting and sharing education data in that world, it unlocks that greater understanding of not just how many students are successful within their education, but how a state or a neighborhood as a whole is able to benefit and leverage those educational successes or address the educational problems. So all this happens when we have proper systems and relationships in place to use collected data, not just for one initial purpose, but for many purposes. So the data on educational outcomes or course offerings, dropout and exit points, it's all valuable, not just to the school or district responsible for managing those data, but either in aggregate or when appropriate at the individual level with other people working with those students and those teachers who are either receiving or delivering education. So proper data sharing agreements and proper safeguards are critical in making sure the data about the education of individual students can be made accessible and valuable to not just educators, but people working in the neighborhood, after-school care, health care, housing providers, a number of people who help build a deeper and richer neighborhood around a school. So it's been in pursuit of enabling these types of benefits, both across education and housing initiatives, that we're excited to continue working with HUD and improve the guidance and resources and information like our data sharing toolkits for local service providers so that they can engage in good and responsible, appropriate data sharing that benefits and hopefully always protects the citizens who are represented within those data, but make it available in a number of different areas. So with that, I will turn things back over to Rebecca, who's going to introduce a team from Seattle that has been working on these very issues.
Thank you so much, Ross. So actually, we're first going to turn to Maria Lana-Queen, the HUD Liaison for Federal Interagency Youth Initiatives and Project SOAR Program Manager in the Office of Public and Indian Housing, and Michael Hawes, Director of Student Privacy Policy in the Office of the Chief Privacy Officer at ED, who will quickly introduce the DataSharing Roadmap report. So Maria, if you want to go ahead and get us started, yeah.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you. Thank you all for joining the webinar again. I'm very excited to introduce the DataSharing Roadmap to each of you. I hope that this tool actually helps spark some new data-driven partnerships between housing and education organizations and provides valuable guidance to organizations that are just starting down this path. At HUD and the Department of Education, we have already seen exciting examples of affordable housing and school partnerships around the country. You will hear from two great examples later in this webinar. Nearly 4 million children live in public housing, housing choice, voucher households, and multifamily. Housing providers and school districts both work hard to create an environment in which these children can succeed. And collaboration between these two sectors can lead to even greater improvements in school readiness, school attendance, and reading and math proficiency. Recognizing this potential, a growing number of public housing authorities, multifamily housing providers, and school districts have formed partnerships. Many of these partnerships include data-driven strategies to improve educational opportunities and outcomes for children living in HUD-assisted housing. HUD and the Department of Education developed the Data Sharing Roadmap as a starting point for housing and education organizations to learn more about the partnership building and data sharing process. The roadmap discusses a couple of things: examples of what data may be shared and how it can be used, first steps in forming a relationship, formalizing the partnership, including establishing written agreements between organizations and taking appropriate steps to protect students' privacy, and tracking and monitoring key performance indicators to measure success. Along the way, we provide examples of best practices, as well as a case study that illustrates how the process could work in a hypothetical community. We also created a great web page for you to find information you need to start your own partnership. There are toolkits, promising practices, research reports, and case studies from around the country. After this webinar has concluded, we encourage you to head over to the HUD Exchange page to download the roadmap and additional resources. We understand that data sharing might be new and somewhat intimidating to many organizations. That's why the roadmap discusses the mechanics of sharing data. Now let me hand it over to Michael to talk more about this. Michael?
Thank you, Maria. As Calvin, Ross, and Maria have already noted, linking housing and education data can benefit students' educational experiences and outcomes. That said, these projects can often be difficult to achieve because of the privacy protections for both housing and education data. The DataSharing Roadmap explains these privacy protections and offers some recommendations for how to successfully link these data while also protecting privacy. We don't have time today to go into this topic in too much detail, but I'm going to walk you through the basics of student privacy so that you can get a sense of the issues involved. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974, or FERPA, is the main federal law that protects the privacy of students' education records. FERPA gives parents and eligible students the right to access the student's education records. An eligible student is one who has turned 18 or who is enrolled in a post-secondary institution at any age. FERPA also prohibits disclosure of any personally identifiable information from students' education records without parental consent unless an exception applies. FERPA applies to any educational agency or institution that receives funds under any program that is administered by the U.S. Department of Education. In K-12, that's your public schools. In post-secondary education, that's pretty much any college or university, public or private, that receives Title IV assistance or federal student aid. So as I mentioned a moment ago, FERPA protects personally identifiable information from education records from disclosure. An education record is anything that is directly related to a student and that is maintained either by an educational agency or institution or by a party acting for that educational agency or institution. The other term that needs some definition here is personally identifiable information, or PII. PII is also defined by the FERPA regulations, and it's a very broad definition. It includes your direct identifiers like Social Security number or student ID number, your indirect identifiers like birth dates and most demographic information. And then it also includes a third category of any other information that either alone or in combination is linked or linkable to the student and that would allow a reasonable person in the school community to re-identify that student with any reasonable certainty. What this last category means is that there is no defined list of data elements that are or are not personally identifiable information. Just about any information can be personally identifiable in the right context. So it requires some thought about what data elements might be identifiable to the students and what protections those data elements have. So the Data Sharing Roadmap identifies a number of mechanisms through which education and housing data can be used for the types of projects that were discussed earlier. By far the easiest option is to use de-identified data. These are data which have had all of the student personally identifiable information removed. Proper de-identification can be tricky though, so we recommend checking out the resources available through the Department of Education's Privacy Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC, at studentprivacy.ed.gov, and the link is there at the bottom of the page. If your project does require access to identifiable data, however, there are a few methods that can allow this to be done under FERPA. Obtaining parental consent is usually the best option, though there are some exceptions to the consent requirements that can also be used if obtaining parental consent is not feasible. These include, for example, the directory information exception, the school official exception, or exceptions for certain studies or audits or evaluations of federal or state-supported education programs. Be sure to check out the roadmap and the resources available through PTAC at studentprivacy.ed.gov if you want more information on these. So here is a link to some of the resources available. Again, also check out the data sharing roadmap, or if you have specific questions, you can reach out to our student privacy help desk at privacyta@ed.gov, and we can help you walk through those issues as well. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Rebecca.
Great, thank you to Michael and Maria Lana. And now we are going to hear from a community that has started to put the pieces together and is currently implementing a data sharing partnership. Brent Jones is Chief Strategy and Partnerships Officer at Seattle Public Schools, and Andrew Lofton is the Executive Director of the Seattle Housing Authority. They entered into a partnership in 2015 and are going to give us some insights into their experience thus far. So Andrew and Brent, take it away.
Thank you, Rebecca. This is Andrew Lofton, the Executive Director here at Seattle Housing Authority, and welcome everyone to the webinar. And I am privileged to be able to share some things that we're doing here in Seattle. Let me start by just talking a little bit about why and how we started the partnership back in 2015. And it really followed on a premise from the Housing Authority world, in which we view housing as not just the obligation to provide four walls to folks, but also to help people become self-sufficient. So we think one of the responsibilities we have is to assist our residents to achieve their aspirations. And obviously, one of the most proven methods of folks addressing their issues and living out of poverty, getting out of poverty, is through education. So we began to think about this in a different way and reached out to Seattle Public Schools to talk about how we might be helpful in their own goal of educating students. And it turns out that we had obviously a pretty clear shared priority and a shared goal of helping students graduate from high school here in Seattle, meaning being Seattle ready, meaning that they're prepared to participate and contribute to our local and global community in their chosen fields. So in 2015, we started this partnership, and we began to try to figure out how we might go about this, and it became very clear very quickly that there were some constraints that we both were working under that related to privacy issues, and we began to get introduced to new terminology like FERPA and trying to understand how that applied and how we might work through that. And so it became very clear that we needed to have some type of formal agreement that turned into a data sharing agreement to be able to access information and data that we could use to really formulate strategies that would accomplish that goal. And that evolved from a attempt to try to get an agreement that we could share data into the partnership that we have today that includes regular quarterly meetings with both agencies' senior leadership, including the superintendent and myself, where we go through information and assessments and analysis that staff are doing with the data to try to identify what are the areas that we should be focused on. And we'll talk a little about one of those here in the a little bit later in the webinar. But today we continually meet on a regular basis. That senior leadership group of both institutions meet, and we have departments that are working together, that are introducing themselves to each other, that are explaining their various goals and responsibilities so that we better understand where we can intervene and where we can interject our efforts into the school district and vice versa so that we can accomplish the goals that we've set out to help our students achieve to their maximum potential.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for allowing us to be on this webinar today. I'm Brent Jones, Seattle Public Schools. And at Seattle Public Schools, we have several strategic initiatives that the Seattle Housing Authority has become an incredible partner in helping us carry out. We are intentionally changing our practices to consider the strengths and needs of the whole child and building preventative, protective, and supportive factors so that at school and at home, children have what they need to succeed. Districts really only have control of what happens within our school buildings. So the partnership with Seattle Housing Authority has helped us to connect to families and key neighborhood resources that play roles in children's educational success. As Andrew mentioned, in 2015, Seattle Public Schools launched we launched an initiative together, but we launched an initiative called the Eliminating Opportunity Gaps Initiative to address the achievement gap between our white students and students of color. Around the same time, the Seattle Public Schools and Seattle Housing Authority partnership finalized our data sharing agreement. Our Eliminating Opportunity Gaps initiative includes strategies at the district, community, and school level, such as fostering welcoming environments, identity-safe schools, building an ethnic studies curriculum, and expanding mentoring opportunities. Seattle Housing Authority's willingness and the passion to partner and share data has helped us to see the connections and resources that Seattle Housing Authority can contribute to our Eliminating Opportunity Gaps initiatives and other initiatives. It's our shared goals that have led us to partner in early 2015, and we started our partnership by developing our infrastructure, which meant surveying and listening to our families and staff across both agencies, staffing up and making sure we had mechanisms in place to make data-driven decisions. This early work helped us to move full steam ahead with launching several initiatives for this school year.
So, in speaking, as Brent indicated, one of the fundamental steps we took was to reach out and talk with our families. And in speaking with them, we began to understand the many intersections between housing and education. We looked at evidence-based practices in family engagement and community supports and system alignment. And we didn't find very much that had housing and education working together. And so we began to think and wonder if we could combine our efforts to build on and innovate on these practices, could we have an even greater impact on our student residents. And so we hope by working together that we can develop a new ecosystem that more clearly focuses on the entire family as opposed to individual pieces. And we think that that will be a much more foundational system for the student and the family to build upon. Early in the partnership, we recognized the need to have better data so that we could understand strategies that would actually have some impact in addressing the issues that our students have had. We also, again, got introduced to the world of FERPA. We had our own privacy issues that we had to address. And so navigating that, as you've heard earlier in the webinar, for us, the first time going through it, it would have been helpful to have the guidelines that have been shared with you earlier. But doing that, it really put us in a position of working more collaboratively together because we both came approach to that. How do we work this? How do we make this work? And so it really opened our eyes as to what we were going to need to do. It also helped us sharpen what our focus was. So as we put the data agreements together and were able to share the information, some things began to get very, very clear to us about what it is that we could focus on, how we could have an impact on our residents' education. What that led us to was an area in attendance that we began to focus on with the district. And I will give you just sort of the answer to the question beforehand. As we focused on the attendance, this year, for example, during the first 20 days of this current school year, we saw a 24% decrease in chronic absenteeism amongst our SHA students going to Seattle Public Schools. I understand that's the largest increase that or decrease that we've had in that statistic in some time. So the data agreement, A, has allowed us to be able to measure that. B, it has allowed us to then identify what are some actual tactical strategies that we can employ that will have an effect on that. And it has elevated for both agencies the principal issue of getting kids in school and the importance of them being present for the education opportunity. We got into this as our data has told us. When we began this back in 2015, 1 in 7 of the Seattle Public School students were in Seattle Housing Authority residences. That has changed a little today because of the increased population of Seattle Public Schools, but we're still a significant portion of the school district. 16% of all chronically absent public school students were living in SHA subsidized housing. And 30% of all the students living in SHA subsidized housing were chronically absent. And you can see in the different education levels where that was. This was one of the fundamental groundings here was obviously if students were not in school, they were not learning. And if they weren't learning at these levels, then obviously their ability to graduate from high school and be participants in our economy would be diminished significantly. So that's why we chose this as the very first thing to start with and to determine whether or not there were ways in which we as a housing authority could bring our assets and our ability to connect with our residents to reinforce messages and to reinforce the kinds of priorities that the district had and determine whether or not that had any effect on the actual student performance in certain areas. And as you can see in this first area, we've had really good progress and we're very pleased with the amount of effort that's been put into there.
Thank you, Andrew. Data drives our work, present and future, and Seattle Public Schools and many districts think about our work in 3 core areas, and we call those the ABCs: attendance, behavior, and coursework. And as Andrew mentioned, this year our partnership is focused on attendance. We cannot build our school community, positive relationships with students, and students can't benefit from quality learning if they aren't in school, in class, and engaged. Next year and in the coming years, we hope we can work together to tackle other elements of behavior and coursework that would result in improved educational outcomes for our students. We are yet to determine what those are, but we know that they're going to be, with the power of this partnership, we can tackle them. Attendance, however, is just the start of the work, and we expect to engage with Seattle Housing Authority further, and we will use both data and family stories to drive our future work together. So what success feels like is that our partnership is focused on creating a positive experience and a supportive ecosystem for all the students and families that we serve so that they can graduate, as Andrew mentioned, to becoming contributing members of our community and excel in their chosen fields. If we are successful in our partnership, this slide demonstrates what success should feel like. We hope that every single student, child, family, and educator can say that they feel welcomed at school, they have adults and a community that care about them, and our educators have positive relationships with families. We also hope that families experience this type of welcoming and supportive ecosystem through our number of pilots that we've launched together this school year. Seattle Housing Authority staff who are connected to residents will be accompanying educators during home visits. We are working at expanding mentorship opportunities for Seattle Housing Authority teams. This year across 5 schools, we have co-hosted attendance reward programs and family-related events. Most recently, Seattle Housing Authority families have created a Somali alphabet book that is now published and will be available in elementary schools and our Seattle public libraries in order to bring culturally responsive teaching material into our classrooms. Lessons learned so far. Number one, we would advise that you find advocates within your organization. Our partnership has the unique roles of Kathleen Paananen and Roy Chan with now cross-sector knowledge of housing and education working in each other's systems. Kathleen was a former Seattle Housing Authority employee and is now at Seattle Public Schools. Roy Chan, a former teacher, school district and city employee, is now at the Seattle Housing Authority. So they are able to connect and ensure that each of our agencies are ready to partner. They help employees see how partnering with each agency is beneficial to their department and individual work. So your partnership could start with one school, one neighborhood, or with a school district department, such as community or family partnerships, and then expand from there. Another lesson learned so far is align and adapt to existing priorities. Work within existing goals and initiatives and projects of your respective organizations. We know that the bandwidth of our organizations can be challenging sometimes, so we think it's smart to work within the context of existing work. And we see the alignment in our eliminating opportunity gaps work because Seattle Housing Authority houses 40% of Seattle Public Schools' Black student population and a significant portion of English language learners.
And the other lesson I think that is important is to start small. I think trying to take over the whole thing all at once is a little overwhelming. So we concentrated our work with specific schools that are attended by residents in Seattle Housing Authority's large garden communities as a way to learn first about what worked and what didn't work before we tried to scale it to a larger audience. And this has been successful so far, and I would encourage you to try some things on a smaller scale before you try to scale it up at a larger level. We're able to leverage that then into how do we change internally our systems to accommodate this work. And with the ongoing leadership meetings that we continue to have with the district, we're able to modify and tweak what we as an institution need to do to advocate for and to really insert the types of strategies in the schools that we believe are having a significant effect and a positive effect on the initiatives that we've set out to do. So thank you for listening. There on this slide, Kathleen Paananen and Roy Chan's contact information are there. That's not them in the slide, but their contact information is there. And for those of you who would like more detailed and further information, you're welcome to connect with them at your leisure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew and Brent. And for those of you who aren't catching this contact info or hurrying to write it down, we will be posting these slides as well as the recording of the webinar on HUD Exchange shortly, probably a few days after the event. So you'll receive a link in your email, so just keep an eye out for that, and we'll have more information for you there. So our final speaker today is Brenda Castillo-Garza. She's the Director of Family Services at Mid-Penn Housing, which is a nonprofit developer that owns more than 100 properties in and around the Bay Area in California. Mid-Penn currently partners with several schools, and we've asked Brenda to talk about these partnerships and what they look like from the perspective of a multifamily housing provider. So Brenda, take it away.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and such a great and exciting moment to not only hear the previous presenters, but to know that so many people are out there striving to do this work, getting started, are interested. It just really reminds me of where we got started and how much work we have in front of us. As most of us housers know, our mission is to house our families first and foremost, and we know that when families no longer have to worry about a roof over their heads, they have the potential of thinking beyond the next paycheck and the future of their children. And so in family services, we really aim to provide intentional and relevant services. And we know that the programs are successful because of the partnerships that we have not only established, but continue to strive to connect with. I'm happy to share a little bit about how we got started. I came from the academics, the education sector, coming into housing. I was excited to see that housing not only cared, but put a priority on education and after-school programming. We visited the idea of what the differences were between a drop-in after-school program versus a daily structured program. We were able to create a new academically driven curriculum that focused on outcome measurements and academic learning for our youth. We also had to recreate the spaces. Our housing communities initially had spaces available for computer labs and learning centers that were more driven by an individual or workshop type settings. We came in and we said we need a classroom-like setting to really promote a world of learning for our youth, a safe place but also an engaging place, which is the picture of what you see in the screen below. That used to be a computer lab and it was transformed into a learning space. We needed to create buy-in from the community internally and externally. What we do in the after-school world, what is it about, what's our drive, what's our mission? Not everybody is okay with transforming your entire program so that it really mirrors what's happening in the daytime school. And through that, it really took our participation in the HUD network with over 16 other housing agencies to start talking about challenges, best practices, and all in all, just a mission that we can rally behind one another and support each other to push forward. As I mentioned, I came from the education background world and thought, no problem, I will go into a school district and build partnerships. I got it. Well, the truth is that it was hard and it takes time. In the education world, it's great what housers do, and so what? What do you mean you do an after-school program? What does that look like? And so we really had to revise our approach and our strategy. We knew we needed to build a rapport with school officials in a different way. We connected with our teachers, our parent liaisons, and for all those on the phone who are coming from the education field, we all know how powerful the administrative secretaries are, so please keep them in a positive light because they get us connected and got us in the door to have these conversations that really made an impact on our partnership development. Some of the continued lessons learned in those first few years is to be patient. I really thought that it would happen overnight because I was very ambitious and hopeful that we in education and housing share that common interest, and we do, but we understand that there are a lot of barriers and challenges and just risks that we're taking, so we want to make sure we're making the right decisions for our communities. Being persistent and creative in our approaches what really mattered. We needed to change depending on the needs of the schools themselves. Having parent support and consent forms was critical. We went into the room, into those conversations with that already in hand, not only because it's a necessity as mentioned earlier in the webinar, but also because this was an ask from our community, from our parents saying, we want our service providers to be involved where we can't or to be advocates for us. And likewise, teachers were asking for our support, and in order to make that happen, these contracts and agreements, data sharing agreements, are really imperative. Our team also looked at other departments internally. Our property management team and our development teams really have these wonderful opportunities to bridge some communication gaps between schools and the home. And so wherever your partnerships are, your departments, reaching out and making this first point of contact is really important. And being prepared and doing our own homework was critical. What does the school need from us? some school districts don't necessarily have a tremendous truancy issue, but perhaps they're looking to further their family engagement initiatives. And so really understanding to go into a conversation with a common goal and a collaborative communication about what's at stake and what's needed and how we can bridge and help each other to reach our goals was important. And bringing an inside look. So we brought in our curriculum, our registration forms, and just an overall look about what we do on a daily basis was very helpful. This slide just kind of goes over a little bit about how we presented that, how Mid-Penn connected to schools in general terms, and some things that were of highlight for our school officials. The data sharing really truly matters. So at Mid-Penn, we come and we share about our success, our goals and our success rates. For instance, our after-school program, our literacies throughout the academic year, we do separate the summer literacy goals because it's a 6-week summer program in comparison to a year-round out-of-school time program. And so to show school officials that we are intentional and adamant about increasing the literacy levels of our youth speaks the same language as far as we are trying to support and empower our residents to strive for greatness. And so in turn, the schools provide, in these contracts that we do have, provide student academic performances, attendance, student behavior, and even parent-teacher conferences. Oftentimes our parents need advocacies or need supporters, need people to be there with them just to say that they're doing a great job, having 2 jobs and raising their children and being involved at the school. And so we provide that through this partnership. And family engagement, both the school and our programs really charge and have a common interest in increasing family participation. So we've had schools come to our properties and provide parent literacy nights and parent workshops and just make those connections with their parents from the schools. We've officially have 4 contracts with school districts, and this really just streamlines the process for us. It avoids us from having to ask and get to know someone new each year if there's any turnover. These contracts just put it down on the table about how sharing the data is important for the schools and for us. And we start fresh at the very beginning of the year to identify how we can work together. The benefits of these type of contracts really increase that home and school collaboration and bridge that gap between communication between the 2 sectors. As I mentioned before, the increase of family engagement and just making sure that we have many opportunities to involve all of those for our children. We've also been able to pilot new programs with other school districts and, of course, go after new funding. We have a long way to go. We have 4 down and 20 to go. So anyone out there, as I mentioned before, it does take time. And stick with it because we know that we can do this. And I'm happy with this webinar and the conversations that are happening because it really speaks to that if we can streamline this process, it'll make not only our job easier, it's that we can really work together and collaborate to get to the ultimate goal that we have. We still need to deepen our scope of services, and continuing this conversation will support us in bridging that gap between home, housing, and education. If you have any questions, here's my information. And again, thank you so much for all the work that people are doing and for being on this call.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And just for folks who aren't able to capture this information right now, a reminder that these slides will be posted on HUD Exchange after the event, and you will receive an email with a link to that page. So now we have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions using the Q&A button in the upper right corner of the screen. Any questions we don't get to, we'll do our best to share them with our panelists and get them addressed in the slides that will be posted on HUD Exchange. But for now, we have a few questions for Andrew and Brent. But if any of our other speakers would like to weigh in, please feel free. And the questions pertain to the data points that are being shared. So specifically, what data points are Seattle Housing Authority and Seattle Public Schools sharing? Is the data being shared in an HMIS system, that's a homeless management information system, or in some other data sharing system or data system? And are you sharing de-identified data? For example, does the housing authority know which students are absent, or is all that data de-identified? So Calvin, or excuse me, Andrew and Brent, if you'd like to provide some responses.
So I'll try to tackle these. So the last question first is no, we're not providing de-identified data. It's the aggregate information that's being shared, so that we don't know the specific student or resident, but we do have information for the school, for example, of what's going on there with our kids. So it's at that level, so it's not down to the individual at all. The second question I lost.
So the second question pertained to, well, the first, second, and second questions pertain to what data points specifically are you sharing, and what data system are you using to share the data?
So it's a data system that is put together by the district and our staff. So it's not a HMIS system. It's a separate system that we've sort of created ourselves. And the type of data that we're sharing gets into academic progress. It's attendance, obviously, discipline, but it's all at an aggregated level. So we know which schools that have a high level of either disciplinary issues, attendance issues. We know how well that school is doing, and the aggregate level of students, how well they're doing academically by subject matter. So we can go to that level, but it is all aggregated. And we have the ability to kind of drill down into almost any question. So it really, the limitations, the way that we're handling the information is only kind of limited by our kind of imagination of what we want to look at. So if we have a question about what's happening at a school, or something that we think is a concern, or we want to see if there's any issues around it, we can pull information that helps us identify what that outcomes are in that particular school, and then we can aggregate it obviously by the district level.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got a couple of people interested in how you went about obtaining parental consent, and strategies that you use to address parental resistance to consent, if you encountered it.
Yes, we have our consent forms as part of our registration and orientation process. So before our students are entered into our program, we have a sit-down one-on-one or group or family orientation to talk about the expectations and of participating in our program, as well as what they can expect from us. And we talk to them about the consent form, and it is a waiver, and most parents sign it because they understand that we take this learning outside of our program and really connect with the schools. However, I will say we have also encountered some parents who say no. I will share a short story, though, that one parent who said, no, I won't sign it, and refused to sign it, then had some issues at the school with their student and wanted us to get involved, and we said we'd love to, and we need that consent form signed, and so they signed the consent form. So I think out of practice and learning of, informing our parents why we use it and what we do with it is really important, but also to bring them into the conversation was key.
Great. Thank you, Brenda. We've gotten a question from a housing provider about who they should contact at the school district to initiate a partnership, but I'd also be interested in thoughts from the educators about, or going the other way too, as educators, who should you reach out to? So any of our speakers care to weigh in on that? Where to begin when you're looking across sectors to begin a partnership?
This is Andrew in Seattle. We were, I think, fortunate here that we had some common interests. So we reached out to at that time, the deputy superintendent, and began to talk with them about a potential partnership, and began to address issues that we had with, from our perspective, of how we could be an asset to help our residents become better students. We were approaching it from the perspective of education being a pathway out of poverty, and so how could we be more proactive in helping our residents in that manner, and just began a conversation along those lines. And there obviously was some interest. We were also fortunate enough to be able to obtain some grant resources to support this to some degree, but the impetus came from the partnership with the deputy superintendent at the school district, who kind of shared our interest in how could the two institutions work better around a common goal.
Great. Do any of our other speakers want to weigh in on that question?
Hey, this is Brenda from Mid-Penn. We did a little of everything. So as I mentioned in the presentation, your teachers, parent liaisons, and how do you get connected there? But successfully, we did also go to superintendents, and one of our contracts actually was driven by our development team, who needed to meet with the school district officials. And so we were able to connect with the superintendent and assistant superintendent. Also, success officers, student success officers. What we found is that in different districts, they call them different things. So whether you're going to attendance or truancy officer or student success officer. So figuring out who those people are and reaching out was also very helpful for us.
Great. Well, I think that's pretty much all the time we have for questions. So again, we will do our best to get responses to the rest of the questions that were submitted and make them available on the HUD Exchange page. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and participants, and urge you to please complete the short questionnaire that will pop up once this event ends. Your feedback is very important to us, and it will be used to inform future programming. So we appreciate you taking a few seconds to do that. So thanks again, and thanks to all our speakers, and best of luck to everyone as you begin to pursue these partnerships.